Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see you all here this evening. Can we just have a show of hands? Who's a first timer tonight? All righty. Well, welcome, and we hope that you will continue to come to our quarterly education series on Alzheimer's disease. So this is the fourth of a quarterly series, and as you can see on the slide, we covered Alzheimer's disease in March. We talked about treatment in June. We talked about behavior and communication in September, and here we're going to wrap it up this year with a talk about how to reduce our risk for Alzheimer's disease, keep our brains healthy. Alzheimer's disease, as you can see on the slide, just to remind you, or for those who haven't been here before, affects 5.3 million Americans. One of the most astounding statistics on that slide, to me, is always that there are 15.7 million unpaid caregivers, close family members or friends, who support people with Alzheimer's disease in our nation. So that means there's 3 close family members or friends involved for every one person with this disease. Also today, a new case develops every 67 seconds, and by 2050, we will have a new case every 33 seconds if we do not identify more effective strategies to prevent and treat the disease. It's currently the 3rd leading cause of death in the nation, costing our nation $226 billion, and that is just direct care costs. You know, Medicare and Medicaid does not incorporate the value of care that the families provide. This slide shows you that the number of people with Alzheimer's disease is going to increase dramatically between now and 2050 to an estimated, as you can see, nearly 14 million people. What's so interesting about this slide has to do with the various age groups. So you can see that across the coming decades, the number of people aged 65 to 74 with Alzheimer's disease, or the percentage, I should say, the proportion of people, will stay relatively flat. The percentage of people 75 to 84 will continue to increase and then flatline. But as the slide so well shows, the greatest growth and continued growth in people with Alzheimer's disease is going to be in those 85 plus. So as we're going to discuss today a little bit again and review, age is the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease.
This slide shows some of the statistics for California. And essentially, 1 out of every 10 Alzheimer's patients in the United States lives in California. So we have about 11%. Currently in California, there's around 590,000 individuals with Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. And within the next 15 years, that number will increase to about 1.1 million. So by 2030, we'll have double the number of Alzheimer's patients that we do now. And for those people who are baby boomers, like Cordula and myself, who were born between 1946 and 1964, roughly 1 out of every 6 will have dementia, and 1 out of every 8 will develop Alzheimer's disease. So you can see not only nationwide and worldwide, but in California, this is a major problem.
So just a little refresher here, and thank you to those of you who have heard me explain this before, but we want to make sure everybody understands the difference between the terms dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and mild cognitive impairment. So dementia is what we consider a syndrome, and it has 3 major characteristics. Number 1 is it involves an loss of intellectual ability. Number 2 is it impacts your memory and 1 or more other abilities such as language, reasoning, judgment, attention. And number 3, the impairment is so severe that you can't carry out your own basic living skills anymore. You're not able to take care of yourself. So dementia is a global umbrella term with those three characteristics. And a good analogy is cancer, because cancer is a big global umbrella term. And, you know, if I opened it up to the floor, we could probably identify 20, 25 different cancers or more, such as breast, lung, cervical, prostate, pancreatic, and on and on. Same with dementia, big umbrella. There are different types or causes of dementia. The number one cause being Alzheimer's disease. Now, mild cognitive impairment is considered a transitional state between what we consider normal cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease or another dementia. So it's a gray zone, a borderland, as the slide says, between normal cognitive aging and dementia. And it greatly increases your risk, I think, as Malcolm's going to explain in just a moment, for developing dementia.
So many of you have seen this illustration before in our other presentations. And what it shows is sort of along the horizontal line is the passage of time, and the vertical axis is showing an individual's level of cognitive functioning. And one of the probably the most important findings in the Alzheimer's research over the last 10 plus years has been the idea that Alzheimer's disease starts in our brain probably 10, 15 or more years before any symptoms actually occur. And this period of time, which is where there's the pathological changes going on in our brain, but there's no obvious symptoms. So there's no problems with memory or thinking. The person is functioning normally. This is called the pre-symptomatic phase or the asymptomatic phase. And during this phase, the individual's brain is showing this accumulation of two abnormal proteins, which Cordula and I will talk about in just a moment, but they're called beta amyloid and tau. And this protein accumulates over time, and over time, it starts to affect the brain. So at some point, the pathology in the brain is such that it will cause thinking difficulties, memory, other types of cognitive changes, and also changes in the person's ability to do everyday kinds of activities. And this is a stage Cordula just mentioned is mild cognitive impairment, because now there are symptoms that are obvious to others, but the person is still able to function relatively well. Now, not all MCI patients, as you learned in one of our previous presentations, will progress to dementia, but the majority will, probably 50 to 60%. Some may stay the same, about 10 to 15% will actually get better and go back to being normal. If it goes on into this stage where the symptoms are evident, then this is where we have the MCI. Some may get better, some may stay the same, but the majority will progress to dementia. And in the dementia, this is where the person no longer is really able to function on their own.
So we wanted to show you the pathology that Malcolm is talking about and just illustrate to you here is a picture of a normal brain at autopsy. It's a side view of the brain, and here want to especially focus on this area right above the ear called the temporal lobe, where there's an important structure called the hippocampus. It's where Alzheimer's disease starts, and that structure is important for learning and memory. You can see in the normal brain how all these hills and valleys, the folds, are all nicely, tightly compacted. Here on the right side, you see the brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease, and the atrophy or shrinkage is very evident here in that temporal lobe. That was so important, again, for learning and memory, as well as in other areas of the brain here in the frontal lobe and in the parietal lobe. Now, what is the actual pathology or abnormal formations in the brain? Well, here again we look at brain tissue at autopsy under the microscope, and this is normal brain tissue. And here on the right, you see the two abnormal formations. These are senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And so on the next slide, you will see the plaques. They look a little bit like Brillo pads. They're made up of the beta amyloid, a sticky substance, a toxic protein that accumulates around the outside of the cell or the neuron and destroys the neuron from outside. And here, these flame-like projections are the tangles, and Malcolm is going to explain to you actually the process that happens inside the cell when another protein, tau, goes awry.
If you could just go back to the last slide. So the tangles, unlike the amyloid plaque, the tangles occur within the brain cell. And so this long extension, this is called the axon. This is a cell body. The cell sends messages down the axon to other cells. Well, this isn't just a solid, or it's not an empty tube like a hose, but rather this is made up of many different little tiny tubes called microtubules. And sort of an analogy would be as if you took a group of drinking straws and you put them all into a group like this, that would be sort of what looks like the inside of this axon. And so these are all little tubes, and there's a support structure that helps keep these tubes nicely aligned, and it also gives the tubes some flexibility so they can move around and bend, because some of our axons are over 1 meter long. And so they need to be flexible and yet still transmit information up and down the tubules. So tau is sort of that structure that keeps the tubules nice and well aligned. Well, in Alzheimer's disease, this tau becomes abnormal. It's this called hyperphosphorylation. And as a result, it's like the railroad tracks with these ties or binds. It's as if these all break apart. And as a result, the lines or the tubules become all broken and tangled, just like in a railroad where the ties are broken, the lines can no longer support the train or the information going up and down.
So tonight we're going to focus on risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and the first thing that we want you to do is to separate out the risk factors that we can't change from the risk factors that we can change. So it's the nature-nurture problem, right? So on the nature side, some of the things we can't change is that we're all getting older, and that's the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Some of us may have genes that make us more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease, namely the ApoE4 gene. And a few of us, 5% of people with Alzheimer's disease actually have what's called a deterministic gene, that if you have the gene, then you're going to get the disease. Family history, which is going to increase your risk for the disease. Being a woman, women are at greater risk of the disease. 2/3 of all people with Alzheimer's disease are women, and having Down syndrome. All individuals with Down syndrome develop the neuropathological changes in the brain we just showed you, and many of them also develop the actual clinical symptoms of dementia and show deterioration. We really want to focus today on the risks that you can impact, what you can do to maintain your brain health, and we'll be talking about those risks on the right a little bit more in just a few minutes. So first of all, just again to talk about age, the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease increases or doubles every 5 years after age 65. So here you see 5% of people affected between 65 and 70. At 70, that jumps to 10%. At 75, that it jumps to 20%. By age 80, that jumps to as high as 50% of people affected by Alzheimer's disease.
Also, gender seems to play a role in that women, as Cordula showed you in an earlier slide, 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. And this slide here is showing sort of the lifetime risk for Alzheimer's disease if you're a man or a woman at a particular age. So for example, if you're a woman age 65 who is healthy now, what is your probability of developing Alzheimer's disease during the remaining portion of your life? It's roughly about 17.2%, or about 1 in 6 will develop the disease. If you're a woman who's age 85 and healthy, the probability you'll develop Alzheimer's in your remaining life is 20.3%, or roughly 1 in 5 will develop the disease. And you can see that is higher in women than it is in men at all of the age groups.
So basically, bottom line today, 1 of 9 older Americans has Alzheimer's disease. Of the 5.3 million people with Alzheimer's disease, 5.1 million are older adults. About 200,000 people under age 65 have the disease. So tonight, we're going to talk about these 6 key ways to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And we're going to start out with controlling cardiovascular risk factors. So first of all, we just want to make sure that you understand a little bit about hypertension. And hopefully all of you know what your blood pressure is and you follow that. The top number is called systolic blood pressure, and that actually refers to the amount of force exerted when the heart muscle contracts to pump blood into circulation. The lower number, or diastolic blood pressure, is the force of blood when the heart is resting between beats. So as you can see on the slide, the cutoff for hypertension is at 140 to 90, over 90, excuse me. And there has been a slight adjustment of these guidelines. Now the recommendation is that if you're 60 and older, in terms of if you have high blood pressure and you're being treated for high blood pressure, your target number can be as high as 150 versus those of us who are younger who need to have our target be at 140 for systolic blood pressure. So at 60 or over, it is acceptable to have your target be at 150 over 90 versus younger adults who really need to have that target be less than 140 over 90. Of course, your doctor is always the one who can best judge what your blood pressure target should be. And so certainly the comments here tonight are not meant as a recommendation, but simply that it does appear that there's some flexibility there in terms of target for older adults.
Well, hypertension, high blood pressure is pervasive in this country. Roughly 1 out of every 3 adults has hypertension. And this data from the Department of Health Services, it shows, for example, that when you're a male or a female, 20 to 64, roughly a quarter of individuals have hypertension. But when you go over 65, it jumps up to a half to almost 2/3 have hypertension. The interesting thing, and this is very relevant for Alzheimer's disease risk, is that the majority of individuals don't have it under good control. So they may have hypertension, but it's not well controlled. And this is showing the percentage.
Are we good? No.
Next, back, yeah. This
Sorry.
is showing the percent of individuals in each of these groups who have their high blood pressure well maintained. And you can see pretty much almost across the age range, it's almost half of them or more do not have their blood pressure managed well. This is looking at some of the trends in blood pressure. And this data came from the CDC in 2014. And the positive news is that over the last 20 years, since about the late 1980s to the 2012, over this 20 plus years period, 20 to 30 years, the percentage of individuals who have high blood pressure has dropped. But even today, this is a percentage who don't have it well controlled, and you can see, again, that it's probably in the older age groups close to 50% in men and even a little higher in women who do not have it well managed. Why is this important? Well, and Cordula's going to talk about that now.
So this slide summarizes a number of research studies that have looked at the relationship between hypertension and Alzheimer's disease. And so just to highlight for you, marked hypertension, and that means 160 for systolic blood pressure, and in midlife increases the risk for dementia anywhere from 3 to 5 times. And even borderline hypertension at 140 to 160 over 90, doubled risk for Alzheimer's disease. And you finally can see that even pre-hypertension increases risk. So very important point here about we have to start these brain healthy approaches in midlife, because what we do as we're younger is going to impact our brain health as we get older.
And even in older age groups, monitoring your blood pressure is very important, because we know that if you have poorly managed blood pressure and you have a stroke, that increases your risk of subsequently developing Alzheimer's disease. The other risk factor we wanted to talk about was cholesterol. And do you all sort of know your cholesterol levels?
Sort of know. Do you sort of know, everybody?
You know, like what the total cholesterol should be. And so for most people, the healthy cholesterol should be below 200. High cholesterol when it's 240, but perhaps more important is looking at the two types of cholesterol, the LDL, or the bad cholesterol, the lethal or low density cholesterol. This is the cholesterol that sort of clogs the arteries and causes a restriction in blood flow, and plaques can develop, and then also breakage where you can have a stroke, a blockage. And then the other type of cholesterol, the HDL, or healthy or high density lipoprotein. This is the good cholesterol, because what it does is it takes the bad cholesterol and removes it and sort of takes it to the liver where it's processed and gotten rid of. So both of these are very important, and the reason that you need to know about this is that, like hypertension, high cholesterol is a very common risk factor. As you can see by these numbers, about a quarter, just like we saw with hypertension, about a quarter of males and females have high cholesterol where it's above the 240. And as we get into our older age groups, it also goes up. It's about 50% have high cholesterol. African Americans are have this as more of a problem, just like they do hypertension, than do Hispanics and Caucasians.
Cholesterol really is important for our brain, but our bodies produce all the cholesterol that we need. And we all understand that when there's too much cholesterol in our bodies, that leads to the formation of plaque. So this slide again summarizes research showing the relationship between high cholesterol, again notice in midlife, increasing risk for Alzheimer's disease 2 to 3 times. And there's a double whammy here. When you have both high cholesterol and high blood pressure, you're again increasing risk up to nearly 4 times. And finally, it is important to watch that LDL and HDL numbers. And here, there was a study that showed that if our HDL is low, remember the target is to have it at 60 or above, and if it was low, and in this study low meant at 40 or below, that was linked to memory decline. So now we're going to shift to diabetes, another medical risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So in diabetes, basically what happens is that your body either doesn't produce insulin, and that's what is known as juvenile diabetes or type 1 diabetes, so that the person is born with, or your body stops effectively using insulin to break up the glucose. So you have an accumulation of glucose in your blood. And diabetes is a very serious illness with very serious consequences. And those consequences do include risk for cognitive impairment as well as heart attack, stroke, vision difficulties, blindness. So it's a very serious illness that needs to be addressed and is actually on the rise. As this world map shows you, the percentage of people with diabetes in the United States, and this was comparing 2010 to 2030, so that's only about 15 years from now. In the US will be, excuse me, somebody hit that, no, we do not want to install anything now. Thank you, Megan. This always happens. Oh, now we want to do, what else do we want to do? Oh, we want to scan. All right. In the United States is going to increase 34%. Now look at some of these other countries across the world. Here in India, 72% increase. Pakistan, 94% increase. In China, 45%. In African countries, 80%. South America, 67%. Diabetes is becoming an epidemic proportions, and again, will impact the risk for Alzheimer's disease.
Well, the CDC estimated that roughly 1 in 10 Americans over age 20 has diabetes, either diagnosed or in the pre-diabetic or not treated stage. And as you can see by the numbers on the chart, the older we get, the greater the number of individuals with either diagnosed or undiagnosed diabetes. And again, as we saw with hypertension and high cholesterol, it's not well managed.
These are just a few of many studies that have now shown a link between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, meaning that, again, that it increases your risk. You can see the study suggests that increases your risk up to nearly 3 times. And again, when we look at these conditions in combination, we've got some cardiovascular disease going on here with high blood pressure plus type 2 diabetes. That further increases your risk for dementia. But it's also been shown that when the hypertension is under good control, that would attenuate that risk and drop it back down. So, so even without, though, I think what's really important to recognize, even if a person who's diabetic doesn't develop dementia, they are at risk for cognitive impairment that's not as advanced as dementia. So now we're going to shift to eating a healthy diet. And so there are several parts of this section that I just wanted to outline for you. So we're going to talk a little bit first about weight and BMI. Then we're going to talk about what we know about healthy foods in regards to brain healthy foods, particularly the Mediterranean diet, the MIND diet, antioxidants, fish, and vitamin D. And we're going to talk about commercial memory supplements. So first of all of you are probably familiar with body mass index, and these are just the cutoffs for BMI. And this oftentimes in studies that are looking at the relationship between weight and Alzheimer's disease, use BMI to make that comparison or look at that impact of weight on Alzheimer's disease. So again, overweight being over 25, up to 30, and then over 30 being obese. Well, you can easily calculate your BMI, and you got one of these handouts, and if you'd like to do this, you can find where you are on that BMI chart I just showed you. But basically what you do is you find your height. So in this case, looking for a height of 5'10". 5'10" would be 70 inches. Then you have to go across and find your weight. So this person has a weight of 153, and you go right back up the BMI chart and you find that this person has a BMI of 22, which is nice, in the nice normal range, right where it should be. So that's how you calculate BMI.
When I calculated my BMI, I'm overweight. I'm not obese, but I am overweight. So let's look at the numbers of overweight and obese in the United States. This data came from 2014, the CDC, and it is showing their ratings of 4 groups: overweight, grade 1, 2, and 3 obesity. And these are the levels of obesity. So level 1 is a BMI of 30 to 34, BMI of 35 to 39 gets you in grade 2, and BMI of greater than 40 gets you up to grade 3. So this is looking at the data over this 20-year period, and what you can see is that the number of people who are overweight has stayed relatively stable in both women and in men. But grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3 obesity has tended to increase. And the percentages, if you look at people who are not normal weight but are overweight or obese, you can see that in the United States, in men, it's probably around 60 to 70%, and in women, it is clearly around maybe 60%.
All right. Well, don't go far. You don't have a microphone anymore. All right. Well, this slide again summarizes research in this area, and you can see, and again, we're looking at midlife. What's going on with you in midlife? And based on the studies, extra weight can increase your risk by up to 74%. And belly fat seems to be a particular culprit here in terms of increasing risk for dementia. So here, though, the third study is particularly interesting because it seems that the age at which we are obese affects risk, with the occurrence of obesity in young adults, so age 30 to 39, is going to really much more increase your risk than at age 60 to 69, for example. So you see from 30 to 39, that's the greatest risk, increasing risk 3.5 times, and then it just keeps going down. And then by 70 to 79, you're kind of in the neutral zone. So if you're obese at 70 to 79, you're flatlining. And then by age 80, your risk actually decreases if you are overweight or obese. So this is kind of an interesting finding. I don't think that we fully understand, except it's okay when you're older to kind of let go a little bit, right?
Going the other way.
All right.
So how does obesity affect the brain? Well, I find this a very interesting study. This was done 2009, and it was a group of individuals who were part of this larger cardiovascular health study. And these investigators looked at 3 groups. They looked at normal weight, overweight, and obese, BMI over 30. And they looked at 94 individuals who remained normal for 5 or more years after this study was done. So these were not people in early Alzheimer's or had any kind of problem. They were just normal, but they differed in their weight. And what they were looking at is they were looking through imaging, they were sort of measuring changes in brain volume. And what we have here are three different views of the brain. This is sort of a side view. This is the back of the brain, and this is the front. The nose would be here. This is a person looking straight ahead at you. So they would be sort of looking out at the audience, and their ears would be along this side. And then this is a scan where you're standing above the person looking straight down. So their nose would be here, this is the back of the brain, and this is the front, and their ears would be along the side. The areas that are shaded, sort of the gray with the brown, that is areas of reduced volume. And what they found in the obese individuals, these are people who were BMIs of 30, but they found that overall the brain showed about an 8% loss of weight volume. And when you physically looked at the brain, it looked like that obese individuals' brains were about 16 years older than their actual chronological age. And the areas that showed the greatest shrinkage were areas of the frontal lobes, and these are involved in executive functions like reasoning, multitasking, speed of information processing, judgment, and also the areas in the temporal lobes that are involved in the formation of new memories and learning. So obesity did, without any Alzheimer's being present, have changes in the brain.
So now we're going to talk about a couple of different diets that researchers have shown actually are very good for the brain. And the first diet that we're going to talk about that is pretty well known is the Mediterranean diet. You can see it's illustrated here. So the emphasis in the Mediterranean diet is on whole grains, fruits and vegetables, olive oil as the primary source of fat, and then when we get up here, making sure we get some fish, and really reducing things like eggs, sweets, and red meat, and a little wine. So some interesting studies. This first one, you can see, followed about 2,200 seniors in New York, and they filled out diet questionnaires, and those who adhered most closely to this diet had 40% less risk for dementia. Now, there have been a lot of studies on the Mediterranean diet as a brain healthy approach. And recently, there was a systematic review. So some researchers who reviewed 12 studies. And 9 of those, which is actually 3/4 of those studies, showed that the Mediterranean diet was linked to better cognitive functioning, lower rates of cognitive decline, as well as lower risk for Alzheimer's. Now, a much newer diet is called the MIND diet. And you can see MIND stands for Mediterranean DASH, Diet Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. And thank goodness they called it the MIND diet. What these researchers did was, you know, all of us, almost on a daily basis, you can get information about what food you should or should not eat, right, for your brain. And it all gets very confusing. So these researchers actually went and looked to identify the nutrients that have been scientifically linked to reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so all of the nutrients that are in this diet have been shown by science to be brain healthy. And it basically takes some of the Mediterranean diet, some of the DASH diet, which is a diet for folks who have cardiovascular disease, so it's for heart health. So in the first study, what they did, and we'll show you the MIND diet in a minute, but in the first study what they did was they looked at 960 people, and again, they were having them fill out food frequency questionnaires, and they found that those who had the highest adherence to this diet were functioning cognitively at 7.5 years younger. So basically, it was slowing their cognitive aging. The second study looked at risk for Alzheimer's disease in about 923 adults, and they found that high adherence was associated with 53% less risk, and again, they're looking at over 4.5 years, and moderate adherence was reducing risk by 35%. Now, in comparison, they compared this to the Mediterranean and DASH diets. And yes, if you highly adhered to the Mediterranean and DASH diets, they were also effective. But only the MIND diet was effective with moderate adherence. So if you highly adhered to it, or you had a moderate adherence to the MIND diet, in either of those cases, it reduced risk. And Megan's gonna help me out by clicking to a better picture, a larger slide of the MIND diet. You actually have this handout, just click on the brain, Megan. Thank you so much. So here's what's in it. Here are the 10 healthy foods that are in this diet. And again, followed strictly, reduced risk by 53%, followed moderately, still reduced risk by 35%. So here are the things that we ought to be eating every day, making sure we're getting vegetables, grains, and 1 glass of wine is okay. Most days, we ought to be snacking on nuts, and we ought to be eating beans, legumes regularly. And then twice a week, poultry and berries, and once a week, fish. So, and here we go. These are all the things you really should be giving up. Red meats, butter, stick margarine, sweets, cheese, pastries, fried and fast foods. And Cindy, I told you weren't going to be able to eat cheese. We had this conversation before. So, so let's talk, we want to talk a little bit about, so you can kind of self-evaluate, you know, which of these foods you're consuming, and if you want to be a little bit more intentional about eating healthy for your brain, these are the foods to incorporate. And now we're just going to look at a couple of items that are on this MIND diet separately. So again, let me see, can I click out? Yes, I can click out, and we're back to where we need to be. So, well, first of all, just in terms of the fish issue, omega-3s are very, very critical for our brain, and they can't be manufactured by the body. So this is something that we have to consume and is critical to our brain functioning. Many of you may know there's 3 different forms: EPA, DHA, and LAA. Omega-3s have multiple benefits for the brain, enhancing communication, stabilizing the membranes of the cells, and protecting the blood vessels, as the slide illustrates. The best source for omega-3s is fish. Now, there are other sources for omega-3s. However, these sources are not as effective, because what happens is that there has to be processing in order to convert the nutrients into the omega-3s, and that's not as an efficient way to obtain omega-3s as through fish.
We just put this slide up because this is really one of the first studies that showed the benefit of eating fish. And this was a study done, it was about 12 years ago, and it was done with about 800 some seniors who were 65 to 94 years of age, and they were being followed over this extended period of time of about 10 years. And during that period, they were taking sort of a dietary questionnaire and finding out what these seniors were eating. And then at the end of the period, they sort of looked at how many of those 800 plus seniors had developed Alzheimer's disease. And they found that those seniors who were eating fish at least once a week, they had a 60% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Eating fish more than twice a week didn't seem to increase the reduction in risk compared to those people who rarely ate fish. So eating fish reduced the risk by 60%. A more recent study was done just last year, and this was looking at weekly consumption of fish and performance on cognitive tests and also brain volume. So what they looked at is they looked over a 10-year period, older adults who were consuming fish, and they looked to see were there changes in the brain. Well, about 5 slides ago I showed you changes in the brain related to obesity. Well, interestingly, what this study showed is that those areas, people who ate fish at least once a week had increased brain volume in the areas of this orbital frontal and anterior cingulate, which are in the frontal lobes, and those are involved in executive functions. And also about a 14% increase in the size of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is in the temporal lobes, and that's a part of the brain important for the encoding and storage of new memories. Interestingly, these are the same areas that showed a loss of brain volume or a shrinkage in those with obesity. So eating fish was actually showing improvements in those areas affected by obesity.
So everyone is usually concerned about the contaminants in fish. And so it's very easy. There's many sources on the web. There's one listed here, a mercury calculator, that you can look on to find the safest types of fish. Actually, it's interesting that the very best way to reduce contaminants in fish like salmon is to just make sure that you skin the fish before you cook it. 40% of the contaminants are in the skin. So, and again, the Mind diet suggests that we eat fish at least once a week. And again, it's important how you prepare it. So don't fry it. That kind of takes away some of the health factors there, all right? What about fish oil supplements? That's another common question. I hate fish. Will fish oil supplements do the same thing? And really, we don't know. Capsules don't equal fish. We don't know whether there's other proteins or nutrients in the fish that are also impacting brain health. We want to be careful about supplements, so you always want to consult your doctor because fish oil supplements can affect blood clotting. But here's the recommended amount, a daily dose of 500 milligrams EPA plus DHA.
Well, what are some of the changes that have been found with fish oil supplements or fish oil tablets? Well, last year there was this study that was well done. It was part of a much larger nationwide study. It's called the Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging study. And this has been going on for probably 10, 15 years now. But what they looked at just fish oil use in people who were normal adults, those with mild cognitive impairment, and those with Alzheimer's disease. And these were people 55 to 90. And they did cognitive testing and MRIs every 6 months for up to 5 years. They didn't manipulate the amount of fish oil. They just said, were you taking fish oil? How much were you taking? So they didn't give some people fish oil to take and some not. This was just an observational or retrospective study. But interestingly, found that the normal adults who were using fish oil supplements showed a greater hippocampal, the temporal lobe area for memory, and also greater gray matter. The gray matter is on the outer surface of the brain, and that's where a lot of our thinking skills take place. So actually, fish oil supplements seem to have some positive benefit for normal adults. It didn't really help those with MCI or with Alzheimer's disease. But the results aren't also positive. There's some contradictory findings. So a number of studies, and we put one large review called the Cochrane Review that looked at clinical trials with older adults who were given fish oil versus a placebo. And some studies didn't find any benefit. Why? It could be due to a lot of reasons. Maybe they were taking fish oil, yet they already were getting enough fish in their diet. And in that case, it didn't really help them. So we're not saying fish oil is the magic bullet. That all you need to do is take fish oil and you'll be fine. That would be a misinterpretation. Fish oil has shown some benefits, but probably more important than fish oil, the studies suggest, as in the Mediterranean and the Mind diet, that eating fish is probably better for you than just taking a supplement.
So another food that's recommended on the Mind diet is berries, and many of you may be familiar that berries, like blueberries especially, are high in antioxidants. So what's an antioxidant, and what is oxidative stress, and what are free radicals? So basically, free radicals are unstable molecules, and they're created during the processing of oxygen. It's normal. Just by breathing, we create these free radicals. And what happens in a free radical is that it loses an electron, and therefore the molecule becomes unstable. Antioxidants that we consume restabilize the molecule by actually contributing an electron to that unstable molecule, as the illustration shows. So antioxidants is really a generic term for anything that can neutralize unstable molecules, or those free radicals. Now, as you can also see in the slide, one of the reasons that we focus on antioxidants is because blood levels of antioxidants are very greatly reduced in both mild cognitive impairment and in Alzheimer's disease. The results are somewhat mixed about the impact of consuming antioxidants on the risk of Alzheimer's disease as we know it today. Now, just here, looking at vitamin E, which is one of the antioxidant vitamins, and this particular study was looking at only food intake of the vitamin, okay? So not taking supplements. And it was shown, and that's a large number of participants, 5,400 almost, followed over 10 years, that higher consumption of vitamin E through food sources reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so that's one of the reasons you're going to see food like berries suggested on the Mind diet. And interestingly enough, vitamin C, beta carotene, and flavonoids were not associated with risk of dementia. And then finally, in a second study that's referenced there, high plasma levels, so high levels of vitamin E in the blood, were linked to reduced risk by 45%.
Once again, you have to be cautious in using vitamins, because they're not all sort of, even though they may be natural, they're not all sort of, some will be harmful, particularly at high levels. And there was a study done by Edgar Miller a number of years ago, where they looked at they did a meta-analysis of 19 different studies. The meta-analysis had a total of like 192,000 individuals. And these individuals were taking high doses of vitamin E. They were on the order of like 2,000 international units a day. If you look at a regular multivitamin, the average amount of vitamin E is around 15 international units. And what they found is that the people who were on these high doses, it did seem to increase their risk of mortality. And so as a result of that, a lot of doctors sort of cut back on the amount of vitamin E they were recommending for patients, because earlier studies had shown with Alzheimer's disease that taking large doses of vitamin E may help to slow the disease. But the Edgar Miller study actually said that if it's over 400, that may be harmful, and probably lower doses, like 150 milligram international units or less, is probably more helpful to you. So should you take vitamins? Well, I think you have to ask your doctor and make sure they approve of that, because certain vitamins can interact with medications. There's another vitamin that has gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, and this is the sunshine vitamin, or vitamin D. And some studies are showing that about a third of older adults are deficient in vitamin D. And we get most of our vitamin D by sunlight exposure. Probably 15 minutes of exposure to sunlight on a daily basis will give you all the vitamin D you need. But some older adults, they don't get out much, they don't get exposure to the sun, and they can develop a deficiency, or they may have a diet that's deficient. So sunlight is the best source for forming vitamin D, but also certain foods, such as the ones listed here: fish, milk, yogurt, cheese, orange juice, cereal, egg yolks. All of those can also have vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiency was much more common probably when you were younger, where people talked about rickets. Vitamin D, however, can also be seen in individuals who have immune system dysfunction, also individuals who have high levels of atherosclerosis, or sort of clogging of the arteries. Many patients of those who have this also show a reduction in vitamin D levels. And also vitamin D level is associated with depression. And so vitamin D is one thing that we at the clinic would always assess in addition to other vitamins like vitamin B12.
So this was a very interesting study just done in 2014, looking at the relationship between the level of vitamin D in your blood and risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so you can see here, involved 1,600 healthy adults from age 70 to 79. They had a blood draw in 1992 or 1993, so assessing their vitamin D, and then again in 2008. And in this study, these participants also had their cognition checked annually over 6 or more years. So they were compared to adults with normal vitamin D levels. So you can see if the participants were deficient, so in vitamin D, they had a 51% greater risk. If they were severely deficient, they had 122% greater risk. So again, in any of these studies that we've been talking about, there's not a cause and effect relationship. So these studies all show associations, whether we're talking about the fish or the heart disease or the diabetes or not. Our studies can't show us that specifically causes the disease, but that there is a increased risk, which seems significant with vitamin D. And in terms of why is this so, it's believed that vitamin D may actually help to clear that toxic beta amyloid protein out of the brain, but really it is too early to recommend supplements of vitamin D to anybody, and we would really need a clinical trial that looked at whether vitamin D or sunlight exposure or a vitamin D enriched diet is actually helpful in terms of reducing risks. So now we want to take a moment to talk about memory supplements, because again, these are probably coming across your email all the time. You can find them on the web. You can see they're very prevalent. Here's about 10 different popular supplements right now. Here is brain power that fights brain fog, enhances alertness, and helps concentration. Advanced brain nutrition. Can't read some of those, but enhanced cognitive function. Well, that's not so different what we're doing today than what we were doing in 1892 when out in the Old West, they were selling brain salt to help you with brain troubles, headaches, seasickness, nervous disability, sleeplessness, excessive study, mania, and overbrain work, which I definitely have a problem with that, overbrain. And it also cures headaches and indigestion, by the way. So the point here is, we've always been looking for a magic pill, some kind of concoction that would prevent or memory loss. And so Malcolm's going to share some information that really shows that it's not too realistic to expect that these things are gonna do anything for your brain. They're mostly, I should say, right now, $2 billion business right now in 2014, and it's growing in the USA by an average of 12% annually.
Well, as Cordula said, all of these are sort of marketed as they'll improve your memory, they'll improve your brain health. The FDA won't allow them to sort of say it'll protect you from Alzheimer's disease. They can't go that far, but they do sort of make these promises about sort of miraculous improvement in your cognition. Well, the evidence that they work is very underwhelming, to say the least. There's no supplement either that you can purchase or a natural supplement that will protect your brain from Alzheimer's disease, or it'll keep you from developing the disease, or slow down the disease, or keep you at a very high level of functioning. I mean, if there was, don't you think we would all be taking that? So what evidence is there? Well, most of it comes from positive testimonials. So you'll see all of these people on the infomercials saying, oh, my mother was confused and I gave her this for a month and now she's like a 20-year-old now. So it's all positive testimonials. You never see any negative testimonials. These not medications, but these supplements are also not cheap. Many of them are 40, 50, 60, even higher for a month's supply. Why are these? None of these supplements are monitored by the FDA. So there's no telling what you're getting in the supplement. You can get a lot of contaminants like heavy metals, mercury, or iron. Also, they're not tested. All drugs that the FDA approves for improving cognition or Alzheimer's have to go through a very rigorous clinical trials, which are called placebo, double-blind trials, where the examiners don't know if you're getting the placebo or the medicine, and the patient doesn't know, and we have to use objective tests. Well, none of these supplements are ever tested with a rigorous clinical trial, and they also don't use objective measures. They use testimonials for the most part. Some of these actually contain ingredients that might be harmful. So this is just a listing of 4 ingredients that are found in many of these supplements. We've also been talking about many of the ingredients that are in these as well when we talked about fish oil and vitamin E. Acetyl-L-carnitine was originally developed as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And it was tried in clinical trials and it was found not to be helpful. It wasn't any better than placebo. But acetyl-L-carnitine, which was sort of designed to help improve brain energy and help with sort of the various formation of transmitters, it can be incompatible with people who are on warfarin or Coumadin. And it also can interact with medications for many other disorders. One of these that has been actually rigorously tested by the federal government is ginkgo. And ginkgo is an ingredient in many different supplements. Probably all of those 10, 12 that we showed you have ginkgo added to it. But ginkgo you can get in your multivitamins, so you'll see Centrum Silver for people over 60 with ginkgo. You can even get ginkgo added to your smoothies. Well, the federal government, the National Institute of Aging, did a large study a few years ago looking at the benefits of ginkgo. And the reason they did this is that ginkgo is a major business in the United States. Probably over $100 million are spent on ginkgo supplements in the United States alone. And so what they looked at is they did this study. It's called the GEM, or Ginkgo Evaluation of Memory Study. It had about 3,000 adults. Average age was about 79. and they randomized them into a ginkgo treatment group or a placebo treatment group, and they followed them for 6 years. The ginkgo group received about 240 milligrams of ginkgo, which is the recommended dose on a lot of these supplements. And what they were interested in, how many of those 3,000 people over the 6 years would transition or convert to dementia. And what they found is that about 17.9% of people on the ginkgo supplements progressed to dementia, compared to 16.1% of those taking a sugar pill progressed to dementia. So ginkgo was totally non-effective in preventing an older adult from progressing to dementia. It also didn't prevent those who had MCI from progressing to dementia. So in other words, people are spending a lot of money on ginkgo, but it's not shown to be of any benefit in terms of reducing our risk for Alzheimer's disease.
Well, now we're going to shift to exercise, and physical exercise is actually one of the best things you can do for your brain based on scientific evidence, and guess what? It really doesn't have to be difficult. We probably remember in the 1970s when the philosophy about exercise was no pain, no gain. You know, you got to get your heart rate up, you got to work hard. Well, revised guidelines that came out in the late 1990s showed that really moderate intensity exercise will do the trick. So it can be as simple as taking a 45-minute walk. And so how long you're active is just as important as how hard you exercise. So walking, for example, most days of the week, or other moderate intensity exercise is recommended.
Well, we've known for many years that exercise is good for your body. It also helps to keep your cholesterol low. If you have diabetes, exercise is recommended. It helps strengthen the heart. It can help with managing blood pressure. So we've known for many years that physical exercise has many benefits for the body. But more recently, there are now evidence that exercise can be beneficial for the brain, and also may be an intervention that could help reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. What do we seem to know? Well, this is a cartoon made up, but it's a rather simplified version of what is happening. But essentially, when you're exercising, your brain sends a signal to the pineal gland, which releases this growth hormone. This growth hormone essentially works on the liver, and it releases this insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF. This growth factor is very good at promoting sort of the health of various body organs. Muscles are particularly well affected, but also bone, skin, liver, the brain. These are also stimulated or impacted by this growth hormone. When it goes into the brain, it actually stimulates the brain to release another particular protein. This is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and BDNF is a focus of much research these days because BDNF is sort of like a fertilizer for the brain. It actually helps to repair damaged brain cells. It helps to keep cells healthy. And more importantly for our discussion tonight, it's also been shown to help clear amyloid from the brain. And amyloid is that sticky substance we showed you at the very beginning that clumps between cells and causes a cell death.
All right, well, here's another summary slide summarizing, as you can see, 5 studies that have all looked at the impact of exercise. And the first was a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis of 8 studies on exercise, and showed that high physical activity as compared to low physical activity reduced risk by 43%. And another important thing to realize is that, you know, it's never too late to start. And there have been studies that look specifically at seniors. And that if they're walking, as you can see, 3 days a week for 15 minutes at least, that's not even meeting the recommended 30 minutes, they had 32% lower risk than those who exercise less. Again, walking, emphasizing how simple this can be, but it is important, again, what we do in midlife. So if we were exercising regularly in midlife, that's reducing our risk for dementia by 62% at age 65 to 79. So really, the importance of promoting these brain healthy lifestyle strategies throughout our lives. So combining strategies is a good thing to do. This one happened to look at exercise and diet, and you can see involving about 1,100 older adults, average age 77, and followed for a little over 5 years. Those that were physically active had about 33% less risk, only physically active. Those who only adhered strongly to the Mediterranean diet had 40% less risk, but those who did both had 60% less risk. So researchers are starting to look at doing these lifestyle strategies in combination. So moving us along, we're going to talk a little bit about also how important engaging in cognitively stimulating activities is. It is so important to turn off the television set. It's probably the most interesting study here on this slide. But again, early in midlife, if you were a couch potato in your 20s and 30s, you really increasing your risk for Alzheimer's disease by 250%. In this particular study, they actually looked at healthy seniors and seniors with Alzheimer's disease, and they asked those seniors or the caregivers of those seniors how much time they'd spent in front of the television in midlife. And you can see that those who developed Alzheimer's disease were spending 27% of their leisure time in front of the television versus only 18% of the time for those who are cognitively normal. And the more those individuals increased or replaced TV with social and mental activities, the lower the risk. This is quickly a study done with, you can see, 54 Chinese older adults, and 593 developed cognitive impairment. They again watched more TV, and they spent less time playing board games and reading. So TV viewing, these are the folks who developed cognitive impairment, these are the ones who did not. The folks with cognitive impairment were watching TV 38 hours a week, all right? Divide 7 into 38, and some of those, now the plus and minus is the range, so that means they were watching TV anywhere from about 26 hours a week all the way up to about 48 to 49 hours of TV a week, compared to those who did not, watching TV about half as much. For board games, those who stayed healthy were playing board games about 3 times as much, and also reading, about 4 times as much reading for those who did not develop cognitive impairment. Also, what about internet use? This slide shows that, the right type of internet use is good for you. And again, streaming TV is like watching television, but if you're challenging your brain, right? If you're challenging your brain using the internet, or in this study, actually using email, was very interesting. Large number of older adults, again, that were examined across 5 time points in 8 years, and those who were using the internet and email regularly actually had improvement in their memory. So delayed recall means remembering information after a delay of time. So on a 10-item task where they were asked to recall 10 items. Now, those who weren't using the internet or were just using it once in a while, their memory performance declined. So again, being digitally literate may actually help improve your brain functioning. And we are at 6:25. You can see
Right.
I'm buzzing along. He could tell I'm buzzing along, so he knows it's time to.
Well, a lot of people were late in getting in,
Yeah.
so.
But we
we'll
also
have to be selective in what we want to cover in
Right.
the last 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, and again, I know the parking was a problem, but then I also want to be respectful of the people who got here on time. So we'll try to be as efficient as possible.
Well, just to briefly tell you, a lot of people are focused on some of these cognitive games. This is one way of keeping your brain healthy, and many of them are things like luminosity, posits science, cognifit. And generally when we break cognitive stimulation, we break it into two types. One is sort of general cognitive stimulation. This is sort of like your lifelong learning, people who engage in like crossword puzzles, who go out and learn a language, learn a musical instrument, continue with taking courses. And then there's other, which is specific cognitive training. These are where you would be taught like how to better remember people's names, or how to process information more quickly. The data seems to suggest that this general cognitive stimulation is better for you than trying to learn specific skills, because these specific skills that you learn don't necessarily transfer to your day-to-day life. And the next slide shows just some claims that are made and whether they're true or false. And yes, training and doing how a specific skill is done, learning that skill more and more, will help you doing activities that involve that skill. It would be surprising if it didn't. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to generalize to other abilities. Will brain games prevent cognitive decline, or will they prevent or delay the progression of Alzheimer's disease? Most likely no. So doing these games will help you doing similar games, but they won't necessarily prevent you from getting Alzheimer's. There are some studies, however, that show that doing certain types of activities will actually help improve driving ability. So doing tasks that help you to process visual information quickly may actually help reduce the risk of automobile accidents.
So I'm just going to quickly talk about staying socially active, and that is another important thing in terms of brain health. And again, this summarizes, and in the interest of time, I just want to say again that both in midlife and older adulthood, our social connections and social relationships are important for our brain health. And that studies interestingly show that loneliness, also perceived, we can have a lot of people around us, but sometimes we still feel lonely. Well, that still feeling lonely is also associated with increased risk for dementia. And finally, depression is associated with increased risk. And this study, or these studies, looked at two types of depression. The type of depression that starts in earlier life, so before age 65, which increased risk almost 4 times, and depression that occurs for the first time after age 65, or late life depression, increasing risk approximately 2 times. And again, you'll have this information for you. There are many various symptoms of depression. On this slide, the ones that are highlighted in red are actually symptoms that we see in older adults that we sometimes don't associate with depression. So irritability is one that we will associate with depression in older adults that's kind of atypical. So we want to encourage you to stay physically, mentally, and socially active. And before I pass this back to Malcolm, if you do have to leave, if you would fill out your evaluation form before you go, that's greatly appreciated.
So one of the important preventions that we think can be very helpful for protecting your brain is getting adequate sleep. And there's been an increasing number of studies that have shown a relationship between disturbed sleep and risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia and cognitive impairment. The relationship between the two is we're still learning a lot about that in science. But generally what we've talked about is that Alzheimer's disease patients have a buildup of amyloid in their brain, okay? And the older we all get, the longer it takes us to clear out that amyloid. In fact, someone who is age 30 can clear out the amyloid from their brain in about 2.5 times as fast as someone who's age 80. What we've learned is that much of this amyloid clearance takes place when people are asleep. So that's why it's important to have adequate sleep. One interesting study that was done just a year or two ago, they actually looked at individuals who were, these were 70-year-old individuals. They were part of the Baltimore longitudinal aging study. And they were in their mid-70s, and they answered questionnaires about their sleep. How long did they sleep at night? Was the sleep fitful, or was there lots of fragmented where they were waking up and getting up and not going back to sleep? Or was it nice, they slept all through the night? And then they looked at brain scans. They looked at these amyloid PET scans, which we talked about and showed before in our previous presentation. And the amyloid PET scan shows the sort of concentrations of amyloid in the brain. And they looked at individuals who were sleeping, this is less than 6 hours a night, 6 to 7 hours a night, and more than 7 hours a night. And the amyloid is shown by this sort of reddish discoloration in the cortical regions here. And what you can see is that the people who slept less than 6 hours a night, or who had very fitful sleep, they showed more accumulation of amyloid in the brain. So it looks like poor sleep may lead to an increase in amyloid. Well, what is the mechanism behind that? And this is an area that's getting a lot of study, but it seems based on animal research that when you sleep, the amyloid, remember, is sort of forming between the brain cells. So when you sleep, what happens is the gap between your brain cells expands considerably. Expands by about 60% in animal studies. And CS, cerebral spinal fluid, which is sort of the clear liquid that bathes our brain and spinal cord, this circulates throughout the brain. And the circulation is much greater. It's about 90% more faster flow when you're asleep than when you're awake. So what is happening when you're asleep, the gap between the brain cells is widened, and also the flow of CSF is sort of clearing out this amyloid garbage. So it's like sort of opening up the storm drains and getting rid of all of the garbage at nighttime. So people who have poor sleep, impaired sleep, such as sleep apnea that's not being well treated, they probably are showing a buildup of amyloid in their brain, and this is something that potentially could be modifiable. So trying to talk with your doctor about trying to get better sleep. And so the recommendation, based on a lot of these studies, is that we all need about 7 to 8 hours of good sleep in order to help clear out this amyloid or garbage from the brain. I've shown you, some people who've been here before might say, oh, well, Dr. Dick is showing us the same slide, he showed it twice before. And the reason for this is we've talked about sleep is important, but it's also important to not be using these hypnotic medications that put you to sleep, such as a lot of the medications that have the PM in it, Tylenol, Advil PM, ZQuil, Benadryl. All of these will make you sleepy, but they also have a very negative effect on the brain. And this study that was done just last year looked at regular use of these sort of anticholinergic drugs, including a lot of these sleeping aids. And what they found is that regular use over a long period of time increased the risk for developing dementia. So the occasional use was okay, but people who use it on a regular, almost nightly basis, they are increasing their risk of developing dementia. So it's much better to look at sleep hygiene and maybe use natural supplements like melatonin that makes us sleepy at night. But if even with sleep hygiene and natural substances like melatonin, you still have sleeping problems, you should really talk with your doctor about this, because more and more we're learning that sleep is very important and can reduce our risks.
All right, so just to wrap it up, I know we're almost 10 minutes over, so we want to avoid head trauma. I'm sure you've heard in the news about the risk associated with concussions and subconcussive injuries, for example, in football. Smoking, we want to stop smoking and reduce our stress, because those are also risk factors. And Malcolm, can you do this in 1 minute or less?
Well, the bottom line is a small amount of alcohol, meaning like one drink, maybe a drink a day, may be helpful. More than one drink probably is detrimental. And this study that was done in Sweden with over 1,200 identical twins born 1907 to 1925, and they followed them for 43 years, and they looked at their alcohol intake. And essentially what they found is that people who had moderate to heavy alcohol use, and this is in grams per of alcohol, but we usually talk about it in ounces, but essentially this heavy use would be like 2 to 3 drinks a day. It increased the risk of developing dementia by about 57%. And it also reduced the time before the person became demented by about 4 to 5 years. So they became demented earlier, the twins who were the heavy drinkers, than those who were not. So a small amount of alcohol may be okay or safe, but more than 2 drinks seem to increase the risk. And this was true both for males and females. And also what they found is that the sort of the spirits.
This 1 minute or less is,
well,
you know.
I'm not good with time.
I know. You keep adding phrases.
But the heavy alcohol, sort of the spirits, the vodka, things like that, was more detrimental than alcohol from wine.
And remember the MIND diet said 1 glass of wine a day. And so we just want to encourage you to implement all of these strategies, to do them together. That really is the most effective way. And we're happy to take 1 or 2 questions and then let you go, and then anybody can stay if they want to talk some more. So is there any specific question or comment? Or is every, oh, back there I see one. Just a second.
That's a great question. How does atrial fibrillation affect the onset of dementia?
How does atrial fibrillation affect the onset of dementia, Malcolm?
Well, I think AFib it's one of those cardiovascular risk factors. And a person, just because they have AFib doesn't necessarily mean they'll develop dementia, but it's just something, because persons with that, where their heart is beating irregularly, they have an increased risk for stroke. And as I mentioned earlier, having strokes are a risk for developing Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, one more question in the pink, and then we're gonna.
Turn the lights on so we can see to fill these out?
Oh, excuse me, Chelsea, yes? We'll turn on the lights so they can see to fill out the evaluation. I'm sorry, I thought you heard that.
Yes.
And
Any other, yes, sir.
Yeah, the studies on vitamin D seem so positive. I was surprised that the bottom line was still not a recommended supplement. Why?
Because again, the studies are showing an association. That wasn't a clinical trial where there was really a comparison to see if it made any difference compared to placebo. So it really needs further study to be able to show that it's really reducing risk.